All right, welcome everybody to our fourth and final webinar session of this year's summer series. Today we're going to talk about the advocacy part of this work of how do you make the case for collegiate recovery or recovery support programs, and how do you get buy-in, right? So a bit of an outline here. Housekeeping, just really quick. The homework for this week is the same as it's been for the past couple of weeks, which is if you haven't done the census yet, please do. And if you haven't finalized your SMART goal for the fall or for the next academic year, keep working on that. And those will be due at the end of next week's session, which is the working group. We're going to talk about making a plan for how you're going to advocate and how you're going to do your outreach. And then we're going to talk about, again, how we advocate in terms of what data do we have, how do we talk about collegiate recovery to folks who've never heard of it before, how do we kind of keep those conversations going? And then, of course, we will have our own conversation with Samantha and Chelsea, who are the Collegiate Recovery Leadership Academy fellows from this past year, who are incredible folks. So we'll start by, again, we're going to kind of bridge the conversation from last week to this week, where actually our second week to this week, where we talked in the second week about asset mapping. So we said it was recognizing, doing the research, listing things out, then mapping, so organizing your thoughts, getting yourself situated. And in the second week, we kind of just left mobilize out there. We said we'll get to that later. Well, today is later. And so mobilizing is when we are utilizing our stakeholders and members of the movement that we are creating on our campus to connect with the assets and garner buy-in. And so we're kind of getting the ball rolling and starting to really compel people to be part of this and tell them and show them why it's important. So we can not just have a map of a team that we think we'd like to have, but we're actually getting folks moving. So in the chat, I know some of you like to engage in the chat more than others, but anybody who's here, feel free to answer. For you, as you talked about collegiate recovery, what has been your go-to selling point? When you're having conversations that kind of get you fired up about this work, what do you find yourself talking about the most? Is there a data point? Is there a story you tell? Put those in the chat, and we'll take a few moments, but we'll wait. And thank you for those who are introducing yourselves in the chat. I think for me, I would often just tell student stories, stories that I had learned from working with students. Wasn't really a data dude until recently, I think. I think that just the work I do requires a little bit more data awareness, but I'm curious what you all use to advocate. Yep, persistence, retention, graduation, of course. We have the language of power in higher education, helping students find services so they don't have to leave. Again, that retention, and then humanizing it with some of the stories, and kind of showing that collegiate recovery can be almost like a guide for how to college for some folks. Yeah. I keep those going because I think we're going to see a lot of these messages that you all are putting in. I'm hoping, my guess is we'll see them reflected throughout this presentation. But yeah, Rochelle, I think data is often that thing that can kind of break the seal of what may have otherwise been a kind of unpenetrable barrier in the university, where if you can make it about money, if you can make it about data, and then again, data of retention, graduation, typically that's when folks have a hard time saying no, because the donors like to see those things. That's really our purpose for being here. And so we'll go through a handful of kind of the main buckets that advocacy can fall under. But first, we're going to talk about making that plan. And keep them coming, folks. This is awesome. So the plan, the way I visualize the plan of talking about asset mapping, getting to mobilizing, is first look at those notes you took, the census you took, whatever you did to create an asset map or an asset kind of brain map, however you did it. Make a priority list, right? If you look at that list of assets you have on campus or potential partners you have, who are the most important or impactful folks? For most of us, it's someone like the president or the vice president of student affairs or the president of the student org or the student government. Maybe it's that faculty member who's tenured and has a willingness to advocate for you all, right? Just kind of thinking through as we're talking right now, who are those most impactful folks or those most impactful offices or partners you've been thinking about? Take that list, set it to the side, make a second list that is a ranking of the folks that you just made a list of, but re-rank them on how accessible they are. And so the reason this is important is, for example, when you compare them, you may have, the president of the university may have been the first person that you thought of, the person that needs to be on board. But your university is so large, or kind of based on your positionality, you know that getting in touch with them and actually getting them to respond is going to be darn near impossible. It's not the case on every campus, but on some it is. So maybe they're not the first person or the person you're going to put the most effort towards reaching out to, but maybe the vice president of student affairs is an easier grab. That is kind of, we're asking through this planning process, the two different lists and then ranking them, we're kind of asking the question, where is the juice worth the squeeze? Which is a saying that I heard a whole hell of a lot last year, I think, was when it was like, I've heard it the most in my life. But it's, yeah, what are the low-hanging fruit that you can take care of really quickly? And then what are those big prizes that if you think it is worth putting the time towards, right? Because you know you get your, you have a good chance at least of getting your effort rewarded in terms of advocacy for these students. And then also take a bit of time to think about what these interactions should look like. If Sam works in the, I guess, case management department, maybe I know that I could just email Sam and maybe Sam will agree to a meeting with me. Where maybe there is a large donor or a treatment facility in the community where I have to plan a trip, or I have to plan a way to kind of cross paths with them. And so, yeah, obviously some people will take different, it'll take different kind of journeys to get connected with different assets that you put on your map, but just being thoughtful and actually planning those out rather than taking the same approach with everyone when it actually might not be the right choice. So just keep this in mind. Again, just making sure the juice is worth the squeeze, focusing on low-hanging fruit when you can, and just getting the ball rolling. Because when it comes to advocacy, that momentum is key. So now we get to the next problem, which is, what if I get to Sam's office and Sam has never heard of collegiate recovery before? Taking the time to have your elevator speech ready. The way I often frame things, and I talked about this, I think maybe in the first session, was I often think about things through the what, so what, now what kind of framework that keeps my brain where it needs to be. So when people say, what is collegiate recovery? I have to then break it down into a couple different questions of what even is recovery according to the work we're doing? How does that compare maybe to the more public or more common definitions of recovery? Why did we make that choice? What does that mean for us? Then breaking that down even more, what is collegiate recovery? Why is it different than regular recovery, or kind of just general recovery understandings? What is unique about it? And then what related data is compelling for setting the stage? And so obviously this is a slide of questions. We're going to try to give you some of these answers as we go forward here. And then the guests can also talk through some of their experiences, but just kind of setting yourself up for giving that elevator pitch. What are those top 5 points you want to make? Borrowing again from what you put in the chat of, this is the main point you often give to kind of to start the conversation. This is just, again, laying the groundwork. And then maybe they're interested, maybe they want to learn a bit more, and you go into the so what. What does this mean? Okay, you know what it is, but why is it deeply important? Why should we continue this conversation? And so this for me is about going from setting the stage to zooming out and looking at the university as a whole. How does the university fit into the larger picture of recovery outside the university? But how also does recovery fit into the university as a large ecosystem? Why does a college need collegiate recovery? What data do you have from the ACHA, NCHA? What data do you have from Alcohol EDU? Do you have any data? It's also a question that's worth asking. And then we'll talk today about the impact of collegiate recovery from what does it mean to the individual. We'll talk about what that data looks like and where it comes from. And many of you may also have more updated data for that. And so we're going to ask you to share a little bit. But also, if we just stopped looking at students as individuals, which is not my favorite thing to do, but if you look at the university as the machine that it is and can be, let's talk dollars and cents. Let's talk about large scale kind of macro issues when it comes to recovery, depending on the audience and what you think they'll find compelling. Finally, just knowing what you want, then now what? What are your goals, hopes, and dreams for this work, for these students, for this university? And then also know a little bit about what collegiate recovery may have looked like already on campuses that are similar to yours. Maybe make a list of universities that maybe your university often benchmarks with. If you're like, for example, again, one of our guests is from the University of Wisconsin. They may be able to look at Big Ten schools, from which there are many collegiate recovery options. But also maybe do informational interviews with those folks who have done collegiate recovery before, and ask some harder questions so that you are prepared to answer the hard questions you receive. And then finally, have a good idea when you come into these meetings or when you build these relationships, where do you see this person or this group or this office playing into the needs of these students? How can they be helpful? How can they also benefit from this work? How do you make this into a partnership rather than just help me, I need your help, right? Okay. So before we get into kind of the data and really the meat and potatoes of this conversation of how I have often had it with folks, I do want to give one disclaimer about the limitations of collegiate recovery research and data. There are many studies, I mean like a dozen studies or so, that get cited a lot in collegiate recovery. You'll see the names Laudet, or the name Laudet a lot, L-A-U-D-E-T. And you'll see a lot of research around the 2013 to 2015 year timeline. It is awesome research. It is very compelling, and we're going to even use it today. And I encourage you all, when we send it out, some of that out to you after the session, to take time to actually read it. We see a lot of people cite research that actually doesn't fit the work they're doing because the language seems to fit, the vocabulary seems to fit. But as we've talked about so far in these 4 weeks, collegiate recovery is actually much bigger than we often think it is. And a lot of, I use example of some of the Laudet data, they often use large universities that have a specific type of recovery involved in a specific format of collegiate recovery programs, that when you cite that in your proposal, for example, you're trying to create a fundamentally different program, just be aware that that might be a challenge, or you might have to explain that a little bit and explain the commonalities, but also be honest about the differences. For me, like, effective advocacy is both simple, but also the moment someone wants to look behind the curtain, we have all of our stuff ready to go, and all of our answers to these questions and all of the honesty and vulnerability about that, we can kind of show that to people. So again, all I'm really saying here is engage with the research you use, read things if you're going to cite them, and acknowledge that there will be limitations because this is a young field. We define recovery differently depending on where we are. We have different resources depending on what university we're at, and just the expectations of what collegiate recovery is may differ. One example I'll give real quick is just, I think there's a piece of data in this slideshow that refers to using sobriety as a measuring stick of student success. Not all of your students or even any of your programs may use sobriety and continued abstinence as the measure of success. You may have students that are incredibly successful, but did have a stop and go in their recovery, or did have a recurrence of use, or abstinence is not really their pathway. And so just thinking complexly, but also knowing that some of the data may not get you all the way there. So I'll stop rambling and get into it. So again, these next few slides are going to be basically me having a hypothetical conversation with a university, but while giving you all kind of a peek behind the curtain of why I say what I say. You all got the What is Collegiate Recovery session week 1 of this summer series. You heard the way I talk about it. Of course, the way I talk about it doesn't need to be the way that you talk about it. You all are the experts of your campus and your students. And so own that, and you get to do that. But of course, like I said in the previous slide or two, I would go through kind of getting some confusion and misconceptions out of the way, kind of providing some definitions. So I say, what is recovery? I use SAMHSA's definition, a process of change through which people improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. I then make it even a little bit more complicated for folks in that way. And I talk through the recovery supportive kind of pillars of health, home, /housing, purpose, and community. The reason I go through those 4 pillars is to make recovery more accessible and show that you don't have to be an expert in the experience of addiction or the experience of a recovery pathway to help create a recovery supportive campus. That's why I choose to do it that way. You may think that that might not be the right way for your campus. And again, that's awesome. I'm glad that's feedback you can give and kind of a way you can steer yourself. And then I just explain collegiate recovery as, for some of you have heard the phrase, a a functional area or like a field of student affairs, a little section of student affairs, where we honor the impact of addiction and ensure that students don't have to sacrifice recovery and belonging for academic success. And then I will often even kind of make that a little bit bigger to include allies or folks impacted by addiction. Some of the initial data that I use or things that I think about when I give these presentations to universities is I look at what is the data we have for your state or for your local area. Do you have overdose numbers for your city or for your state? Because we know that, again, we had lost 93,000 people to overdose deaths in 2020 during the pandemic. And so hopefully what this means, sadly that we have to do this, but hopefully it means that we've had more transparent and open reporting of overdose deaths, but it will vary state to state. I will often, again, zoom out some more. I go all the way out and talk about, we have about 10% of adults nationally are living in recovery, identify as having overcome some sort of a substance use challenge. That's how the study that this comes from, they define recovery as overcoming a substance use challenge. So it's 22 plus million adults in the United States. And then SAMHSA has a study, which I'll put in the chat right now, I think I have a link, from 2014, which said that in 2014 that 1 in 8 children live in a household or grew up in a household where a parent or guardian experienced addiction or a substance use disorder. And so why I use that 2014 study and why it's important 7 years later is people who are children then are like we are students now. And so you're finding that even if students don't identify as in recovery or with a substance use disorder, they likely grew up in a house where someone did. Or there was a study, I think, by Penn State that was coming through a couple of years ago. I don't know if it's been published yet, but that about 1 in 3, 1 in 4 students knew somebody who had overdosed and passed away. And so stay up to date with those kind of numbers. Just as if there were no recovery support, this is what we're being complicit in. So let's try to change the tide as a university that is often a center of culture and a center of community and a center of resources in our local area. And with all of that in mind, we're now going to talk to my buddy. I gave him a name last year. I can't remember what his name was. If someone wants to name him in the chat, they can. But this kind of monster looking dude, for me, represents that one person in that meeting, that advocacy meeting, that stands up and points their finger and says, hey, who do you think you are? And they often ask the question, and some of you may have heard this already, why would we want those people here? Why would we want those students to gather? Why would we want yada, 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 stigma, judgment, shame, yada, yada. And yeah, it's hard to not hear this and just be really disappointed and just kind of like break down a little bit. But I think if we can prepare for this question beforehand, like we're going to do today, then we are able to take that moment and turn it on its head and maybe clap back at this person a little bit, maybe a little more professional than that, but to have a well-formulated response. So we have 4 ways to respond. You can use all 4. You can use 2, 1, 3, 4, however many you want to use. But depending on your audience, you may want to kind of navigate these answers. Those answers in my book are, well, they're already, or if you're a person in recovery, we're already here. Students in recovery are, in many ways, the model student. We already promised that we would serve these students and for various reasons, and it's in our financial interest to do so. So the next few slides, I'm going to go through these responses and talk to you through some of the data or some of the messaging that I use to back up these points. Take notes if you'd like. Also, if you have better or more complete reasoning or additional reasons you want to add in, throw them in the chat. Let's share today. Because again, this is a movement that if we all kind of hold it on our individual shoulders, then it's hard to lift. And so if we can lift together today, that'll be helpful. Okay, so we're going to start with they're already here. So again, some people just think, oh my gosh, I don't know a single person or a single student in recovery, therefore they don't exist. Just kind of silly to think that because I don't know a person who identifies in a certain way, they must not exist. That's how a lot of bigotry and a lot of stigma survives. But we're going to move past that judgment. And we're just going to give the straight facts, right? So here on this slide is a calculus formula on per 10,000 students on your campus, how many students could benefit from collegiate recovery now, right now at this moment. meaning how many students are currently searching for alcohol and drug support, seeking recovery. And so the kind of the foundation of this formula comes from Texas Tech's replication curriculum, I think is what it's called. If you just look up Texas Tech Collegiate Recovery Curriculum, it'll come up. But some of the numbers will be different because I think that was published 10 years ago now, about maybe 8 years ago. But we have updated some of the numbers in these slides. And so if you go to that, the numbers won't quite line up. But we're going to send you our Collegiate Recovery Program business case, which I've sent to some of you already, at least in my working group. But it's basically a 5 or 6 page workbook, or like kind of formula on how to create some of this data for your campus. And so you take per 10,000 students, we know a third of them meet the criteria for substance misuse. I believe that's the number of students who binge drink. And then we know that about 1/8 of our students meet the criteria for substance dependency. And so then I actually don't know the answer to this. So if someone does know the answer to this, please let me know. But the Texas Tech curriculum asks us to add these two numbers of people who misuse and people who are substance dependent, alcohol dependent in this case. We add them together and then we multiply by the percentage of our students that seek help for substance use, which is 3.24% of students who have a problem who seek help. And that's how we get the 148.6 in this case. So about 149 per 10,000 students are actively seeking help. The thing I want to point out on this slide is alcohol specific. I personally find 150-ish students per 10,000 to be very compelling, especially because I was on a campus that had about 60,000 students. That's a lot of students who, according to this calculation, are actively seeking recovery support or actively seeking support overcoming a substance use disorder. But again, this only is alcohol. So this does not include eating disorders or any sort of maladaptive, addictive behavior that is not substance use. It doesn't even include other substances. And the reason we settle with just alcohol is, for me, that it feels conservative on purpose, so that you can, if people say, oh, that's way too high, you can respond with, actually, this is the lowest conservative answer we can give you. Where it's actually probably maybe double this, depending on your student populations, depending on if you have certain colleges on campus or certain degrees, like a law degree that we know has a higher risk of substance use disorder and things like that. But I do want to note that most recent research findings have found that 48% of our students have met the criteria for an alcohol or cannabis substance use disorder at some point during their first 3 years of college. So again, we are saying here that only about 12.5% of students are currently identifiable as having a substance use disorder, but almost half of our students at some point will have a substance use disorder. I'll get to your question here in a minute, Rochelle. It's a great question. But yeah, so this is just a calculus we use. Again, you'll have the budget or the business case I'll send to you all. There'll be links to all the research we use to find these numbers. I would encourage you to dig in and find the limitations, honestly, so that you can answer challenging questions and be honest with folks that you're advocating towards, because they'll appreciate that. And that might also give them more and more context to how they can help you. And if you have more recent data or different numbers, let us know. We're not up here saying we know all the exact answers. Okay, if you have questions about this, feel free to put them in the chat. Rochelle asks, the newest version of ACHA and NCHA gives us assist scores for both alcohol and cannabis. I actually have not used the assist scores. Can we use that same type of data, same type of math using that data? I will actually look into that, Rochelle. And if anybody does know about the assist scores in the ACHA, NCHA, feel free to engage in chat. But I'll get back to you, Rochelle. And like I said, this calculus is just one example. A lot of you will have ACHA or alcohol EDU data for your campus specifically. If you can do that, if you can use your data, especially if it's a higher number or it's a more clear number than what you see here, use that instead. Pick and choose, be a good advocate for yourself. and make this data as impactful as possible. We take these numbers from the national data because not every school does very good with data, and because we have to use this on a national scale as well. So we're just putting as many tools as we can in your hands. The next slide is the point that for us, we believe in these students. We have leadership academies, we have all these great programs. We think in a lot of ways they are the model student. A 2014 study from Dr. Alexandra Laudet and others et al. Demonstrated that students who are active in well-established, well-funded, staffed, institutionally supported collegiate recovery programs have higher rates of retention, graduation, and grade point average than the average student. We mentioned this already in the chat, that these are points that we like to use. And like I said when we first started, please at least be thoughtful about comparing what you have or what you want on your campus. But I think this data came from, I believe, Texas Tech. Look into the data that I'll send you the research article, the 2016 version of this article. Compare what you have, what you want based on what these programs that we're being compared with, or where they get this data from. Because I don't want to be disingenuous and say that, oh, we have a 6-student collegiate recovery community, and I would like $5,000 from this university, and they say, why? And you say, oh, because a fully staffed, fully institutionally supported, fully funded in all ways collegiate recovery program was effective. There's a bit of a mismatch there when it comes to data and effectiveness. So just be honest about that and talk about goals and where you want to go, knowing that where you may be right now is just a start towards those goals. But I would struggle to promise higher GPA, higher graduation rates, higher rates of retention from day one, just because you said so. Just be thoughtful there. But the thing that I think is not for debate is that these students are living the lessons of recovery. And what does that mean? What does recovery mean for a student? At the very least, it means resilience, dedication, self-awareness, and service. And I don't, as a student affairs professional myself, I don't think I would have ever asked for more than that from a leader, a student who could be a leader, or a student who could make a positive impact on our campus. We're going to send you the 2016 section of some of this collegiate recovery studies that will then cite back to these the previous studies from Laudet. But I don't think it is a stretch in any situation to say, well, we know that students in recovery like to serve their university or like to pay back the things that they were given or like to serve the community, and therefore we should empower them. I think that's, you don't need a whole lot of data to make that make a lot of sense and make that compelling. So just want to throw that out there. The third one is we promised. This is my favorite. If you've ever heard me talk about advocacy, this is the one where I can twist some arms. I'm not a guilt and shame type of person, but I am an integrity person, where if someone makes a promise, I expect them to follow through with it or own that they're not. And as many of you know, universities make a lot of promises. And so the first point of this is that we kind of have to confront our university with its own values, its own plans, and its own communication. You all have likely heard from students where they have felt disappointed, underserved, less than, excluded. And so let's gather those and let's use those as data. And so the first one that I often talk about with folks who are kind of on the edge of collegiate recovery is, we know right now, I think ARHE has about 140 members or so. It could be higher or less than that, or more or less than that. But we know that there has never been a data point that shows that there's always been less than 5% of universities that have recognized support for students in recovery. So if your university wants to be a national leader, or they say they want to be a leader in the state or in the community, what better way than to see a clear need that is only being met by, or only being attempted to be met by about 5% of universities? Why can't we be a leader there? Why can't we utilize what we have to make sure these students are included? On that same page, I always encourage folks to look at their university's 5 or 10-year plan, because those plans are full of goals, promises that are made to fundraisers, alumni, incoming students. Those 5 and 10-year plans are the list of demands the university has for itself. And so if you know that a collegiate recovery program could bolster one of those promises or one of those goals, be loud about it and be proud about it. And one of those goals and one of those values is often something around social justice, inclusion, accessibility, yada, yada, serving the state, serving the community. Those are deeply important things. And the reality is this work intersects with those things. And so if you can be clear about that, you're thinking about that from day one, you're thinking about having an accessible collegiate recovery program, you're thinking about having an inclusive collegiate recovery program, so that you're modeling those things in what you're designing, but also the fact that what you are designing exists means the university is putting some effort into making the university and higher education inclusive and accessible for students who have been impacted by addiction. So if you're talking social justice, you're talking inclusion and equity, make sure you're also walking the walk. You don't want to be caught kind of spewing that as a value, but not showing it in yourself, not showing that your program is trying to do better, that your staff is developing. You've got to talk the talk and walk the walk when it comes to these incredibly important issues. And it also, like, one way to do that is if you're starting a collegiate recovery community, for example, have your collegiate recovery community advocate with other people for other causes. Maybe it's Pride Month and you bring your collegiate recovery community to a Pride event, or it's a different kind of Heritage Month. Bring your students to those events and make sure that those students know that this is part of the vision here as well in recovery, because the recovery community outside of the universities is often not the most inclusive place. And so by the time these students kind of funnel their way through various levels of exclusion to become a person in recovery, to become a person in college who's also in recovery, you often have to do a lot of work to make sure that we're all attempting to be as inclusive and as equitable as possible. Okay, a couple more slides and we'll bring in the guests. But I'm not going to go through this a ton. This is a money slide. Money talks, right? If someone heard all 4 of the points we just made, and they're still like, oh, whatever, like, I still don't believe you, or I still don't care, we are going to give you the business case, which will show you how much money a university could save year on year by paying for a collegiate recovery program. I think Larry has went through it, or Larry has seen it here in the audience. I don't know if he's done anything with it yet, but we use this pretty often. One example of a point from that business case is that per 10,000 students, if you have a $30,000 a year tuition, your campus will save about $2.229 million each year by retaining students, half of the students who are seeking help for substance use. We know, all of you know, that a lot of our students who withdraw because of substance use related reasons. And collegiate recovery can help address that, and the ecosystem that collegiate recovery can help create can help address that. And so just by retaining half of the students that are seeking help, it's a lot of money. And again, that number will scale based on how many students you have. You multiply that by how many tens of thousands of students you have, or divide it. And then also you scale that with your tuition number. So that's just an example. The business case we'll send you has all that information in it. Same conversation we had last week, but I want to revisit it one more time, is the role of students here in this advocacy work. Obviously, using student stories is important. If students want to share their story, I'm sure our guests today have shared their stories in some way or another. That's awesome. And you as a staff member, I believe your job is to not burn these students out. So be thoughtful, be careful, make sure we're not just relying on these students to be our martyrs, so that we can somehow then make the university a better place. One way to do that is to work with your partners on campus, to work with other offices to hear about their experiences when they're looking to serve students in recovery, or the case managers on your campus who have had to tell students in recovery, sorry, we don't have a lot for you, or they've seen students exit or enter the university with these needs. Having that context and having a broad understanding of what the university's experience has been, even though those stories are very rarely told, because they're usually stories of failure. Of course, we have students in recovery often succeed and are incredible students, but that doesn't mean that the university has often been there to support them. I won't go on that soapbox very much longer. We're going to send you a bunch of stuff in an email. We're going to include all of you on that email. If you have other things you want to share with everybody, new research you found, if you wanted to share a research overview that we didn't share, really just kind of keep the ball rolling with research that you use, or data that you use, and we can, again, all be better for it. And as we bring the speakers in, I just want to ask a very quick question of you all to put in the chat. Based on the conversation today, who do you think might be your biggest advocacy partner on campus? Put in the chat if you'd like, but at the very least, think about it, of who is that first person you want to reach out to today, or tomorrow, or next week, when you're ready to do advocacy, so you at least have your first step. All right, so for the final 23 minutes, that went longer than I intended, but we're going to bring Sam and Chelsea with their cameras and so they can unmute themselves. Hello. What we're going to do is first want to have you introduce yourselves. If you want to do your name, what university you're at, if you want to give your pronouns, and then just a very, very quick overview of kind of what your relationship with collegiate recovery is. You know the first question, so you know where we're going. But if you want to kind of give those first points, Chelsea, you can go first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Chelsea Biggerstaff. I actually did attend our Austin Community College, where I just graduated in May with my associates in social work. And this fall, I will be attending the University of Texas at Austin, continuing my bachelor's. So my involvement with collegiate recovery actually started with Safe Project. I was fortunate enough to have a friend, actually a colleague, who did Safe Project, was also a part of the Leadership Academy prior to me joining, and had passed along the information and said, I think it's a great opportunity. You should try it out. And I was like, I was not even aware that colleges did this, to be honest with you. So I sent in my application and started with the Leadership Academy. And then very quickly started working on a project, which eventually became creating a collegiate recovery campus for Austin Community College. So that was basically the beginnings of my collegiate involvement, or collegiate recovery involvement, and has since flourished and grown. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get to that too.
Thanks, Chelsea. Sam, what about you?
Yeah, so my name is Sam. I use pronouns she, her, and I am actually a new program coordinator for our CRP Badger Recovery at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So my involvement really started with building the program from the ground up. I was hired on as a grad assistant to really switch our initiative. So we had like a student organization that was kind of faltering. So our leadership kind of advocated to get me on as a grad student to kind of really help our program push forward. And, fortunately, I was hired on as a full-time staff person. So, the university is really starting to recognize the need and the successes of our program. So honestly, I'm just kind of excited to see how things go forward. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you all.
That's like the dream, is being a student who does this work and then they actually offer you the job. So many people graduate and get bitter. It's like, I wanted that job so bad. They wouldn't like either interview me or even pay for it. So super excited for you. The first question, and Sam, you can start this one, is, can you give a quick overview of what your experience has been in the advocacy realm? Because obviously you serve students directly and you're kind of ramping up for your first full year, but even as a student, what were you doing for advocacy? How did that go for you?
Yeah, and I think, like I sort of mentioned, like this all kind of started with like that fallout of our student organization. And really it was just finding the reasons to kind of get us to start as like a full university recognized program. And like really all you need is one dedicated person to kind of like start that up. So really it's just like advocating yourself and kind of advocating for other students. Like really, I know that like there are these like really great programs that offer a lot of services, but really all you need is one person. And I guess like another person to really have a meeting, like all you need for a recovery meeting is 2 people and a pot of coffee. So like just really getting that started. And really then the next steps are just like figuring how to get like students involved, like how do we retain them? How do we support those students? How do we keep making this space seem safe and welcoming on campus? And I think really having those student voices telling us that like, hey, we need your support, it's on us to kind of do that. And like really having those student voices telling us to follow this track is really what helped us. Like it wasn't just me, it was a bunch of students. And really, if you have a bunch of students knocking on the door, that's really all you need. But yeah.
Yeah, and even the folks in the audience who are kind of looking to get this work going, maybe for the first time, you all may have students who are helping you, and some of you will not have any students yet who are kind of with you. And so, we're going to kind of go through some of those different experiences here today. But Chelsea, what about you?
Yeah, actually very similar. It was a lot of advocating for, myself and other individuals in recovery is I found in my experience, kind of early on when I started, maybe not so early on, but when I eventually started meeting with like the faculty and staff members, but they were not very familiar with recovery in general. So really just even having to explain like a really brief overview of like we, mentioned in the slides, like what is recovery? What does this look like for individuals in recovery? Why is this important, right? All of those things, and having to really just nail out those pinpoints for everybody was the challenging part, I guess. But once we kind of got through that and everybody got on board, it's been a really worthwhile experience that I'm grateful that I get to continue.
Yeah, just a quick note is some folks in the chat that faculty are going to be some of the people they reach out to start. A very quick and easy win for faculty is like a syllabus statement of what does this campus offer, or a basic needs statement about if you're struggling with this, or that, or including substance use, just let me know. Just making sure faculty are communicating with students that they are human and they know that students are also human can also be a really easy, quick win for folks who are looking for that. But yeah, so the next question, and Chelsea, you can go first on this one, is have you seen any like turning points or milestones? Because the reason we asked this question is, as both of you probably have experienced, this work can get very frustrating and almost lonely at times. Of if you can't quite measure your success, you're not quite sure where the turning points are. It's hard to kind of keep going sometimes. But yeah, any turning points or milestones that you've noticed that you would kind of encourage other folks to also look out for?
Well, yeah, especially with starting a CRP at Austin Community College. Just the sheer fact that they agreed to do it was a pretty big turning point, because that clearly meant that the advocacy that I was doing in the beginning got through to them. Like they understood the need, and somewhere in their minds, there was a turning point for themselves, and they became allies in this fight. So that was a huge turning point. And then since then, and I will say that this was not an overnight thing at all. And sometimes, like you mentioned, it's a little hard to stay motivated when you're like not seeing those successes like as quickly as you would like. And it was a year-long process that they're just now implementing, but they've actually agreed now to fund a good majority of it and give the space for it. And those are really big accomplishments and turning points for the Collegiate Recovery Program and for those of us in recovery in school. So yeah, it was, looking back on it, that year was so worth the milestones and the stuff that we're seeing happen now.
Yeah. Sam, do you have any thoughts on kind of what the milestones looked like between, like kind of from when the moment you saw the student group was not quite what it needed to be to the moment where you got hired? Like what were some of the points that you were kind of motivated by or that kept you going?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for us, like with many campuses, I think it's like really safe to say that the pandemic was a huge turning point for us. So like we pretty much had to start from scratch, like in an all virtual program. So like, not only does data confirm that the pandemic adversely affected addiction rates, but like it's also going to have a huge impact on like campus culture to come. And, this academic year in general. So, like throughout the program, like Badger Recovery was really this like central hub for students to come like in search of community, friendship, and just like overall support, whether that be like in their recovery or just like feelings of isolation or anything that the pandemic really caused. And I think having our campus leadership really see the results of some of that impact, and seeing that so many students regularly came to attend our meetings, like we had the same faces showing up every day, showing that like obviously our program is meaningful to them, and they're obviously coming every week because they feel supported in this group, is like huge. And that's really just like kind of the start of collegiate recovery. Like, yeah, we have these meetings where students feel safe, but like, can you imagine like all the students that we haven't reached yet? So like there's so many like paths of growth that are really bound to come. And kind of I keep thinking about our shift to like this hybrid in-person model and like how that's going to change everything. Like stigma is really huge on our campus, and like maybe that virtual place was a really good start for us, because that anonymity factor on our campus is kind of a really nice thing. So it's just kind of seeing like how we're going to continue navigating these waters and, you know, battling stigma.
Yeah, I guess a quick question for the two of you is how did you celebrate the little wins? How did you keep kind of appreciating them? So I know, again, it can be hard to wait until you've gotten there before you take a breath for a little bit. Sam, if you want to go, if you have any thoughts. But
yeah, celebrating wins. You know, I'm a big high five person. Like I would tell my partner like all these things. Like if we had like 10 people show up to the group, I was like super ecstatic. I was like, I need to tell you about this. Like this is like a huge feat. Like for us at Live Free, like we only had about like 2 or 3 people who came in, and like usually it was like at least one of the students who was like running the group, and then maybe 2 or 3 people would trickle in at different times, so they didn't even get to interact with one another. But when we had like 10 students showing up and we had this like awesome meeting, like, you know, like I cried tears of joy like after the end of the meeting, because I knew like we're impactful. Like, you know, we started from scratch and now we have like these students who like feel like they're part of a community. And yeah, it was just awesome.
Chelsea, do you have any fun stories of celebration?
Yeah, I'll also, like I mentioned, I have a colleague who went through SAFE, the Leadership Academy, but he also went to Austin Community College years ago and had tried to start a CRP. That was originally one of his things that he wanted to do there. And so throughout this process, I've been, and also fun fact, he was my mentor through the Leadership Academy this time around. But you know, sharing my experiences with him and him just saying things like, you got a meeting with the department, that's further than I ever got, or little things that like was really encouraging to know that like, oh, it's just a meeting. And he'd be like, don't discount, that is a huge thing. To have that sort of support was really important. And then also, I would say, as cliche as this may sound, just keeping a positive mindset for everything and just having that like every day, just going like, well, they haven't said no yet. So that's a victory in and of itself, right? That was kind of like my thought process up until the ending.
Yeah, that's great. What do we have next? Oh gosh. Yeah, what has been your biggest challenge so far? Chelsea, you want to start on this one?
Yeah, the most challenging part, I think, was just getting, like I said, getting individuals to realize what recovery actually is. For those individuals that it was very foreign to. Outside of going to school, I also am a peer recovery coach. So I work for a nonprofit organization here in Austin, which is, it's an RCO, a recovery community organization already. So like in my day-to-day, I'm constantly surrounded by recovery, right? My own, other people's, I go to school for it or for social work. So the fact, I don't know why, it just never really occurred to me that there are individuals who do not know a soul in recovery. And that was kind of mind-blowing to me, let alone having one person like that, but multiple people gathered in a meeting and they're all like part of the deciding factor for your program was challenging to get them to realize, one, like I said, what it even is, and two, why it's so important when they don't have any personal ties to it. So that was really the most challenging part was, I guess, trying to frame my narrative to fit the audience that I was talking to. So at first I had started with very sort of emotional appeals of like, I went to school and dropped out of college when I was younger. It took me 16 years to get back into recovery and then finally go back to school. And they were like, I don't know what this is. And I was like, oh, we need to change the narrative, right? Let's talk about money and, you know, the other selling points that you mentioned. So really just figuring out who my audience was and the best way to approach it really was the most challenging part.
Yeah, it's hard to define recovery in a way that is clear, but also doesn't just meet people at their own stigma, their own stigmatized beliefs.
Yeah, that was a big part.
Yeah. I'm sure we'll get to some of those annoying or difficult questions here in a moment. But Sam, do you have any moments that were kind of most challenging for you?
Yeah, and I think for us, stigma kind of plays that major role here. And that comes in like many levels on our campus. So, you know, the alcohol culture is like huge, not only on my campus, but just like in Wisconsin in general. And then you add that extra layer of us being a Big Ten school, you know, it's ingrained that we're obviously like this party school and students are coming here to party and be immersed in that environment. And sometimes it's kind of hard for students to reject that and find like an alternate pathway. And like another super challenging thing is just kind of balancing the magnitude of our campus and like who do we talk to, who do we prioritize and engaging with, because it's really hard to extend our reach out to everybody. Like I remember us doing a needs assessment kind of early on, and like I reached out to a lot of programs and we got a lot of feedback from like some programs that were like super amped about us like having this program, and others I didn't hear anything from. So I didn't know if they were sharing anything out with their students to help us kind of get some answers about like who might be in recovery or not. So it's really about finding those partners who are really going to support you, and also finding those partners who you kind of have to do a little bit more work with and kind of like really nag them and let them understand that like this is super important and we need to make sure that our students feel safe and secure. Like obviously you're going to see them more often than we are because they're in your classes, they're in your programs, but if they kind of come to you, you need to know where to direct them. Because, you know, we are a big campus, like there are a bunch of resources, but if students don't know that they exist, they might never, you know, like walk into our door. So it's really just navigating who do we want to prioritize as partners and who do we want to kind of like figure out where we need to take some time to like pick at some of those more, I don't know, problematic folks.
Sure, yeah. Just real quick on this question, to be asked in the chat earlier, like do either of you have like a favorite talking point that you often lean on that you would like to kind of share with people? Either you can go first on this one.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of folks already mentioned, but like I kind of like to amplify those student voices. Like at the end, we kind of just ask some of our students, like if you can boil down into like one sentence, like what the impact of like Badger recovery was, like what would that be? And we had like well over like, I don't know, like maybe 8 responses, and like students shared like some of the most like heartfelt things. And like we were able to share that with professional staff, and they were like, wow, dang, this is like really great and impactful. Like, why haven't we been doing this before? And I'm like, yeah, why haven't you been doing this before? Like, this is, you know, this is like why we're here. So yeah, I just think like amplifying student voices, like whether it's through like statements or students sharing their stories and experiences, like I think that's kind of been kind of like that tugging at heartstrings has really worked for us.
Yeah, Chelsea, what about you?
Yeah, I wish that I had been thinking with COVID and everything. And then obviously since we're still creating the CRP, and we didn't have a whole lot of students to actually get feedback from, unfortunately. But it kind of did work out because I found that the most responsive sort of talking points were a lot of the logical and a lot of the not necessarily just financial, but like you had mentioned, going back to the values, one of the things that is a high priority right now for Austin Community College, which I assume is for a lot of colleges actually, is the diversity, equity, and inclusion. So having a meeting, we had actually set a meeting with our chief DEI officer and ran this by him and got his full support. And really those sort of just coming back to saying like, well, you said you want to focus on this, you know, and in recovery, students in recovery is a very equitable issue. And then that kind of helped to change their mindset too, to go like, oh, you know, I've never thought about it that way before. And that does fall in line with what we want to do. So that proved to be a really good talking point.
Yeah, to kind of piggyback off of those, one talking point that I mentioned a couple of times, but is like an established collegiate recovery program, especially if, for example, UT Austin partnered with the community college system around them, that is an accessibility at a college, like pipeline issue of like, hey, we now have a reason for these students to transfer in and know they can do it. And folks like Chelsea can go to this program after going to the community college, and you can now like talk about that. Yes, it's a financial conversation, and it's a literal goal of the university conversation is to be successful there. So with 3 minutes left, I want to boil the last 2 questions down to the final question we have. which of course, if there are just general questions you want to make sure people hear you talk about that you've been asked while advocating, feel free to share. But any surprising questions you've been asked? I think it was a bit jarring for me for the first time to be asked, like, why do you care about these people? Like, oh God, excuse me, like, oh crap, like, okay. But anything, it doesn't have to be cringy, but any questions you didn't know if you were quite prepared for when you were doing advocacy work?
I did get the biggest one, weirdly enough, that I wasn't ready for was why would we create a space for individuals in recovery? Wouldn't that be breaking their anonymity if they were to go to a place for? And I was very much thrown by that and realized, like, oh, that's the concept that they have of what recovery is like a very traditional 12-step, maybe, like, we don't talk about, and I had to reinforce, like, no, we want individuals to identify as being in recovery. This is a good thing. And really having to explain those questions led to me understanding the overall stigma behind everything, and that they were coming at it from more of an addiction standpoint rather than a recovery standpoint, and gave me some work to do along advocating for changing that.
Totally. It's a smart distinction. I think we often get caught in that when we're talking about addiction, because that's compelling. When we're talking about recovery, that's kind of slippery sometimes. What does that mean? How do you actually put your hands around that? So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. Sam, anything that you've been asked that's a little bit surprising?
Yeah, I think I always find myself being surprised by that what's next question, since everyone is always interested in kind of like what impact this program is going to have. So obviously I always don't have a full answer to give, because our programs are continuously changing and adapting, because that's what our students are doing. So what's next is always dependent on like what students want, what they need, what they desire from the program. It's figuring out what I can do to get a student to either get their foot in the door or just like send me an email showing interest in the program. And it's also just figuring out what I can keep doing to make, Badger Recovery a safe and welcoming and inclusive space for any student on my campus. Like, we're all about like equity and making sure that all students feel safe and secure on our campus. But like, really, what are we doing to ensure that students in recovery are thriving and succeeding academically? And that's really what I'm trying to kind of like throw back at them. So what's next is like, yeah, I want to start this program, but how are you going to help me accomplish that so our students can continue thriving?
Yeah, kind of always knowing what the ask is before you go into the meeting. Be flexible, of course, but kind of having some ideas what those could be. If folks have questions we're out of time. If folks have questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes after the session. But just finally, Sam, Chelsea, thank you. Thank you. So happy both of what you both have been up to. Obviously, both of you were incredibly successful in the Leadership Academy. Yeah, thank you for spending time with us. For the folks in the audience, again, census, if you haven't done it yet, do it by next week, then have your SMART goal ready. Then next week, you'll get an invite for the final working group. That's all we have. But again, Sam, Chelsea, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah.